Ah yes, that wonderful sound of a lancer revving in your periphery right before you get splatted. Gears of War would not be the same without its famous multiplayer component. So shortly before release on the 10th of September, the Coalition has been offering an early tasting of that half in a multiplayer tech test to people who have pre-ordered the game or members of Xbox Games Pass on these last 2 weekends. While we at DF are waiting for that final release to cover all versions of the game in much greater depth, we nonetheless thought it would be interesting to look at the technical makeup of Gears 5 as it currently is in this tech test, how it runs, and with that form a good idea of both the multiplayer and single player experience you will be probably seeing in early September. So let's nail that active reload, rev up our Lancers, and roll on with the analysis of the PC and Xbox One X versions. After having loaded up the tech test on PC for the first time, I was rather impressed with the presentation and options for tweaking immediately as the game auto-starts you into the bootcamp training sequence, where you take on the role of a man with perfect hair, Delmont Walker. This experience in bootcamp looks to be a preview of the single-player graphical settings and presumably a closer look as to what performance that may entail in its final release. Gears of War 4 on PC and all Xbox One systems was an impressive looking and running game at release in 2016, but the team at Coalition have definitely been iterating on their art pipeline and technology since then. Immediately noticeable to my eye were the extensive utilization of screen space reflections and the healthy usage of per-object motion blur on PC. Gears of War 4 definitely used screen space reflections in single player on all platforms, but it also offered up a wonderfully expensive advanced setting above Ultra on PC, which simulated glossy reflections. On this insane setting, reflections stretched, hardened, and approximated differing materials in a much more believable fashion than Ultra or high below it as found on the standard Xbox. It was a crazy expensive setting for that time, cutting performance by nearly 45% in most scenes, as it was seemingly shooting out many rays per pixel into screen space. If you think about it, that's just about as expensive as turning on ray traced reflections to low in Battlefield 5 on most GPUs, so it was not very viable for most configs if you wanted to keep that frame rate up. On the default Ultra settings in this Gears 5 tech test, those type of glossy screen space reflections found previously on Insane can actually be found on nearly all of the game's surfaces, even on those with lower reflectivity, as the SSR on Ultra seems to have a very low cutoff point, so more surfaces get real-time reflections instead of reverting to cube maps more readily. This time the SSR on Ultra performs pretty well, while looking quite a lot better than reflections on High, which has a very high roughness cutoff, meaning the reflections are not added to surfaces that should actually have them. Furthermore, reflections on High look to shoot out only highly coherent rays into screen space, meaning that they cannot simulate that same stretching, darkening, or hardening that you see on the Ultra setting, so they are simpler, less accurate, and apply to less objects, kind of like the Ultra in the last game. It would appear that the Coalition here spent time optimizing those Ultra-style reflections, and it has a massive impact on the realism of many of the game's surfaces. By the Coalition turning down the amount of rays shot per pixel in screen space for those reflections on Ultra, they remain performant, plausible, and not overly sparkly. In fact, this time it looks like they've reserved more rays per pixel to that Insane setting for screen space reflections, which honestly at most viewing angles looks incredibly similar to Ultra and is rather superfluous. Only with a low grazing angle or lower overall resolution like 1080p would you start seeing greater benefits of utilizing that Insane setting. That is an unspoken rule that applies to basically all settings which ramp up to Insane in the game on PC at the moment. As is, Insane is a setting that is barely worth it and is perhaps bugged, as they don't even seem to apply properly in the menu and nominally revert back to Ultra, well, except for screen space reflections. That setting sticks properly for some reason. This rule of superfluousness is especially true if you look at the Insane setting for volumetric lighting, which takes the FPS from a good deal north of 60 at 4K Ultra on an RTX 2080 Ti to a cool, filmic 24 FPS or so on Insane. Yeah, definitely not worth it. Switching over to Xbox One X in these scenes shows us presumably what we can expect for that single-player experience in Gears 5 in comparison to PC. Settings that look closest to the high settings as found on PC. This setup is extremely similar to what my colleague John Linneman analyzed in 2016 when looking at the differences between PC and Xbox One back then. In this tech test, the Xbox One X maintains that awesome motion blur as found on PC, but loses those ultra reflections, which actually add quite a lot to the environmental materials. But that's just the largest and easily visual standout. Otherwise, most settings between high and ultra like Gears of War 4 before this are just iterative refinements, and they're not obvious to the casual glance, unlike screen-based reflections. As is, the game looks excellent on Xbox One X and is comparable to the higher-end PC version. And that's really the major difference in the quote-unquote single-player component between the PC version on an ultra-high-end GPU and the Xbox One X. But that is just the opening bit, as most of the tech test is in fact dedicated to versus multiplayer. This is where I spent most of my time on both platforms playing the arcade mode. Arcade mode is a faster and, in my opinion, more enjoyable experience than what I have played in Gears of War multiplayer since probably the third game in the series. This is where the game's performance and control handling is key to what makes it such a satisfying experience in the tech test. As announced at the game's initial reveal, Gears 5 on Xbox One X is targeting 60 FPS in all modes while outputting 4K. This is in contrast to Gears of War 4, which was initially 1080p 30 in single player on Xbox One base systems and 60 FPS in multiplayer without motion blur and an adaptive resolution. On the release of the Xbox One X, Gears 4 was patched, adding the ability to play at 1080p 60 in the campaign throughout in a performance option, or 4K 30 while maintaining more advanced effects, textures than the original Xbox One release. Multiplayer in both modes on Xbox One X ran at 60 FPS with a dynamic 4K setup. This last bit is basically what we're seeing now for the entirety of the Gears 5 experience on Xbox One X, and the game is just so much better for that fact now, maintaining smooth animations and crisp controls while compromising resolution when effects work heats up. Unlike Gears of War 4 though, Gears 5 does to a degree look like it's using Unreal Engine's temporal reconstruction filter to reconstruct up to a full 4K output image regardless of the real dynamic internal resolution of the game. This keeps the game looking honestly quite great, even as the resolution is changing. It is far less obvious and much less intrusive than a standard bilinear upscale to 4K. In the preliminary pixel counting of this tech test, any one given aliased edge in gameplay can be somewhere between 2160p and bottoming out to resolutions around and above 1440p. With my being able to count resolutions such as 1944p, 1728p, and 1512p. These are all resolutions that depend heavily upon what map is being played, what effects are on screen, or whether or not it is utilizing the single-player graphical options. That added motion blur and greater use of effects and real-time lighting, and compared to a heavier usage of static shadows as found on multiplayer maps, will definitely push that number down closer to 1440p more often. That dynamism and resolution means that Xbox One X, in all of my play of this game, is basically not dropping any real frames in combat in the versus multiplayer where it matters. Even in the toughest smoke-filled fights, I saw no frame drops. Boot Camp, on the other hand, had a slightly different performance profile. Along with generally having a lower dynamic resolution due to more real-time elements in post-processing, I was able to find some small tearing and frame drops at the very end of the boot camp as my man Dell faces off against a pack of rival DBs. Just to make sure it was not a one-off thing, I did play it multiple times and still saw similar drops. That type of minor drop from 60 FPS in an otherwise flawless frame rate experience in the boot camp does make me wonder how the full-on single-player campaign will actually play out if such a minor shootout incurs such tearing. Given how dynamic the resolution is, perhaps this drop is not GPU related and it is in fact a storage, streaming, or CPU related frame rate drop. While Xbox One X is running a dynamic resolution, Gears 5 on PC curiously has it missing in the menus. Unlike last time in Gears of War 4, where the ability to switch on dynamic resolution was another powerful tool in the awesome arsenal of getting Gears to run as best as possible on your system. While dynamic resolution scaling is missing in the tech test on PC, we are graced with that same extremely robust set of graphical options as seen in Gears 4, with the addition of HDR support this time should your monitor or television be capable. This is an area though where I'll have much more to report on in my full video covering the retail version of the game. Just like Gears 4, there's also an incredible benchmark which gives you all the information you could ever want to know about your rig's performance. It is a bit hard to say at the moment about how representative that benchmark is for single player gameplay, but in my experience, it is more GPU and CPU intensive than Boot Camp, and it's especially more GPU intensive than versus multiplayer. Your versus multiplayer frame rate will probably be 35 to 45% higher on average than what this benchmark showcases. Even then, the benchmark is a great way to showcase performance differences between GPUs. On default Ultra settings, the RTX 2080 Ti with a Ryzen 1700X managed below 60 FPS rather often in the benchmark scene, yet Boot Camp ran more or less flawlessly above 60 FPS at all times. As mentioned, versus multiplayer is an entirely different story. While multiplayer on PC in Gears 4 allowed you to turn on motion blur, this time it is forced off, just like on Xbox One X for the tech test. That combined with more simplistic levels and a greater usage of baked lighting and shadows makes it run decidedly better than the benchmark or Boot Camp. Here the RTX 2080 Ti was running at 4K Ultra settings at 60 FPS without a single problem. There's probably enough headroom to invest in sillier performance options like insane quality for SSR. Moving over to the mid-range sees a curious anomaly. At 1080p and Ultra settings, the RX 580 showcases a nearly 10% constant higher performance advantage over the GTX 1060. As mentioned though, the benchmark is heavier than the rest of the game available currently, so both GPUs can indeed run the game at Ultra and 1080p at the moment and achieve 60 FPS. The curious thing that I mentioned though is what happens at high settings at 1440p, which is more similar to the settings as seen on Xbox One X. Here that difference between the GPUs on average drops, with the RX 580 only pressing an advantage in the first part of the bench, and the GTX 1060 then having more or less equivalent performance in the back half of that benchmark sequence. In-game in versus multiplayer, the RX 580 and GTX 1060 at high both vastly exceed 60 FPS. Really no problem at all. On Ultra, I saw a strange situation where it would appear actually that the GTX 1060 managed a bit better at keeping the game at 60 FPS, but both GPUs would drop below 60 in any of the cinematic outtake moments at the beginning and end of a match where depth of field is added onto the scene. This looks to just be one of those strange moments where the GTX 1060 manages to be equal or above the RX 580 when we don't necessarily expect it. Since that's the case, I think it's better to wait for the full-on PC version to get a greater sense of the overall performance with prepared launch drivers. Until then though, I hope you enjoyed our quick look at the Gears 5 tech test on PC and Xbox One X. At the moment, it is shaping up to be a great multiplayer performing title. Single player though remains a bit of a mystery, and I'm curious about how well it will in fact run 60 FPS or not when the going gets tough on Xbox One X. And if you are out there watching this and work for the Coalition, well, please do consider the inclusion of a dynamic resolution option, much found like in the last game. With such a dynamic resolution option on PC, players could play at ultra quality settings without manual shifts downward to clear up those rare areas where the game is at a high load. Or even it would allow them to play on Xbox One X quality settings and have resolutions that go up to similar heights as found on Xbox One X. In the meantime, I will hope that that may happen, and I also hope that you will hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, well, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry puts out a video. If you want to talk to me about your experience with Gears 5 in this tech test on PC or Xbox One X, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.